Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Vice-Chancellor and Principal, Professor Nana Poku, I have great pleasure in welcoming you to the inaugural lecture of Professor Anne Strode. The Vice-Chancellor conveys his heartiest congratulations and best wishes to Professor Strode. Inaugural lectures form part of the university's public lecture series and may only be presented by recently promoted or appointed full professors in academic schools and centers. These prestigious lectures present an opportunity to showcase the exciting and groundbreaking research and teaching being conducted by professors at our university. Each lecture represents a significant milestone in an academic's career and serves as official recognition of their promotion or appointment to full professorship. Moreover, the lectures are an ideal opportunity for new professors to introduce themselves and present to academic peers, students, and research collaborators an overview of their expert contribution to their field. Equally importantly, ladies and gentlemen, inaugural lectures are also a platform for celebrating a professor's academic achievements with her family, friends, mentors, and colleagues. As we celebrate Professor Strode this afternoon, I would also like to acknowledge the following guests: members of the university's executive management, members of Senate, our inaugurant this afternoon, Professor Anne Strode, Acting Dean and Head of the School of Law, Professor Warren Friedman, family and friends of Professor Anne Strode, academic and professional staff and colleagues, and our students and alumni. I also want to extend a very warm and special welcome to our guests from universities and organizations in South Africa and across the globe. Distinguished guests, I'm now pleased to introduce our Acting Dean of Law, Professor Warren Friedman, who will formally introduce the inaugurant, Professor Anne Strode. Professor Friedman, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Reddy, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my honor and privilege to introduce our inaugurant this afternoon, Professor Anne Strode. Professor Strode is a full professor in the School of Law in the College of Law and Management Studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. As is sometimes said in academia, Professor Strode is a homegrown scholar. This is because she received all of her qualifications from the University of KwaZulu-Natal and one of its predecessors, the erstwhile University of Natal. Professor Strode's qualifications, in the order in which she received them, are a Bachelor of Arts degree, a Bachelor of Laws, a Master of Laws, all from the University of Natal, and a Doctor of Philosophy from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Professor Strode began her academic journey when she joined the School of Law as a senior lecturer in 2001. She was appointed as an associate professor in 2017 and as a full professor 3 years later in 2020. Before she joined the School of Law, Professor Strode worked for the Department of Health and more specifically in the Chief Directorate for HIV and AIDS. It was during this period that she developed her research interest in HIV and AIDS as human rights issues. Apart from HIV and AIDS, Professor Strode's research interests also include bioethics and the law and children and the law. And as the title of her inaugural address this afternoon indicates, she has managed to successfully combine these research interests in many of her scholarly papers and publications. When it comes to scholarly papers and publications, it may confidently be said that Professor Strode is a highly productive researcher. Over the period of her academic career thus far, she has published 68 peer-reviewed books, chapters, and journal articles. What is even more impressive is that 16 of these articles have been published in high-impact international journals, including the Journal of International AIDS Society, the Lancet HIV Journal, and Reproductive Health Matters. Besides her numerous publications, Professor Strode has also successfully supervised and graduated 7 doctoral students, 5 full research master's students, and numerous coursework master's students. Professor Strode has also supervised 2 postdoctoral research scholars. She is currently supervising 2 doctoral students, both of whom are under examination, and a further 3 who are at various stages of completion. Professor Strode's expertise and her contribution to knowledge have been recognized by prestigious bodies and institutions outside of the University of KwaZulu-Natal. She has, for example, been invited to serve as a member of the South African Law Reform Commission's Project Committee on AIDS and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights HIV Expert Group. In addition, Professor Strode has also been invited to join a number of research collaborations with other universities, both in South Africa and elsewhere. These include the HIV/AIDS Vaccines Ethics Group at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, the Desmond Tutu Health Foundation at the University of Cape Town, the Data Monitoring and Safety Board for the Chain Study at Oxford University, and the Steering Committee of London University's JIDETSA study in Zimbabwe. Professor Strode is also a model academic citizen. She has served as an academic leader in the Socio-Legal Studies Unit in the School of Law and as a long-standing member of the Research and Higher Degrees Committee. Professor Strode is also the Deputy Chairperson of the Human Science Research Council's Research Ethics Committee and a member of the University of KwaZulu-Natal's Biomedical Research Ethics Committee. As her membership of these 2 committees suggests, Professor Strode is also an expert and scholar in the field of research ethics. Her expertise was recognized by the United States National Institutes of Health in 2021, when, somewhat unusually for a law academic, she was awarded a significant grant to manage and coordinate a master's program in health research ethics. This program, which is known as the South African Research Ethics Training Initiative, or SORETI, is aimed at building legal and social science capacity on research ethics committees across the African continent. Finally, as many of those in the audience today are aware, Professor Strode is an avid long-distance walker. She successfully completed the Italian Camino a number of years ago and will be tackling the Swiss Camino later this year. As a long-distance walker, Professor Strode knows what it means to dig deep and to go the distance. And I'm sure that these qualities will continue to serve her well as she strides, or should that be strodes, into the next phase of her academic journey. All that remains for me is to congratulate Professor Strode and invite her to deliver her inaugural address entitled Coming of Age, a critical review of the legal ethical framework regulating adolescent HIV prevention trials from 2001 to 2022. Professor Strode.
Thank you to both Professors Friedman and Professors Reddy for that such a warm welcome and introduction. Today's topic, and in fact this entire inaugural lecture, is dedicated to 2 people who I wish could have been here today, both Eric and Brenda, who still missed. So it's very difficult, let me say at the outset, to really try and think of what do you talk about in an inaugural lecture when you've got to try and reflect back on your academic career and the depths to which you've actually researched and worked on issues for, like in my case, the past 21 years, but still make it something that can be easily understood across such a wide community of persons who might be watching this particular presentation. So after much consideration, I thought perhaps what would be best is to look at the ethical legal issues around the participation of adolescents in HIV prevention. because it has just by pure chance been 21 years that I've been an academic. And I felt that it is perhaps then time to look back at where I'd started. So if I go back to 2001, believe it or not, the university employed me as someone who was already 6 months pregnant. I only had one publication. So really the future of research in my hands was not going very well. Certainly didn't look like I'd have a productive future. But it was really by chance that my research career changed, and that was through an interaction with the HIV/AIDS vaccines ethics group, which Professor Friedman has already mentioned. They were an externally funded unit based at the School of Psychology in Pietermaritzburg, and they invited me to start collaborating with them on, they had a grant to look at the ethical issues around running HIV vaccine trials in South Africa. And they asked me if I wouldn't try and bring the legal aspect to this, which was quite remarkable, really, because I had no knowledge of research. I had my one little publication, and I didn't know anything about clinical trials, but I did have expertise in the field of HIV and AIDS. So it was from that point we really muddled on. But what was significant is that it meant from my first year as an academic, I was actually brought into a research organization who had a grant, and there were senior people working in it who were able to mentor me and really guide me along this pathway that I've been walking for the last 21 years. And it was so helpful because for many young academics, you come to the university and where do you start? You've got 1 million lectures to start preparing, and what's going to be your research area is quite a tough question. So I was certainly much, much luckier. So in this lecture, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to go back and look where we started 21 years ago, with that very little knowledge that I had, and just reflect a little about that. And I thought I would then conclude with just some of the lessons that I learned along the way that I hope would be of some value to my younger colleagues and other people who are wanting to start their own careers in academia. So let's start with, at the beginning, let's start with why even when we talk about adolescent HIV prevention studies, why they're important? Why even be concerned about them? Well, they are both public health and human rights rationales. The public health rationales are that South African academics are at high risk of HIV infection, and particularly younger adolescents and young females. That is really where the heart of the HIV epidemic still remains. So it's of critical importance that we try and develop interventions, prevention modalities that they can actually use to try and stop this further spread of the epidemic. It's not only because we want to stop the epidemic in that age category, but we also know that our SAPRA, our Drug Regulatory Authority, will actually not register new products unless there's now data specific from that age group. And so on that basis, we really have to do these studies. There are also strong human rights rationales to why we should include adolescents. And this is where there's been a shift over time, because traditionally we didn't include children in research because we wanted to protect them. If we go right back to, for example, the development of the smallpox vaccine in Edward Jenner, he tested the vaccine that he was trying to create in his gardener's child and the gardener's son. And it was those sorts of experiences that made policymakers very cautious about the enrollment of children in research. So generally children, we just didn't do studies on them. Instead, what we did is we would take adult data, try and extrapolate from that how drugs and other interventions would work with children. Don't try and divide it according to their weight to work out diffusion rates, etc. And this was obviously meant that children were actually exposed to potentially harmful interventions because there was no data on them. But in the last 2 decades, we've seen a shift in the rights discourse away from this protective approach of children to actually recognizing that that's a form of unfair discrimination. Excluding children means you're excluding them from the benefits of research. And increasingly, especially in the international literature, we're now seeing people speak about the right to science, that everyone, including children, have a right to benefit from scientific progress and its applications. And we can only do that if we actually involve children in research. Now, although we don't actually have this right to scientific progress in our Bill of Rights, from 2014 onwards, this is referred to in the regulations dealing with which relate to research with human participants. And what these provide is that we cannot systematically avoid the inclusion of vulnerable participants. And they define children as part of this group of vulnerable participants, because to do so would be unfair discrimination. And this vulnerable populations are entitled to benefit from science. So there is reference in our law to this importance of involving adolescents in health research. So if we then move from that point, so we accept their public health and their human rights rationales for having children in research, we still face a problem. And that is that even today, as I speak, there's the underrepresentation of adolescents in health research. So what's wrong? Why, given these strong and valid rationales, why are adolescents still not in research? Well, there are 3 big challenges that we face. The first is that of the legal capacity of children. So children only become adults at 18 and get full capacity then. Below 18, though, they do have evolving capacity, and adolescents, we define them as 10 to 19-year-olds, certainly especially as they become older teenagers. There is increasing legal recognition of their capacity. So from the age of 16, for example, they can consent to sex. From age of 12, they can consent to contraceptives. But it remains an issue that we have to obviously be concerned about, because we know, given children's limited legal capacity, they're not always able to protect their own rights and interests. So particularly in the consent process, we have to ensure that there is protection for children. There's some sort of balance there between protection and recognizing their evolving capacity. So our first obstacle getting adolescents into research is that of their limited capacity. The second big set of challenges, all linked to HIV prevention studies, by their very nature, they are complex when we try and enroll adolescents in them. And again, it's for a number of reasons. The first being that we do HIV prevention studies with adolescents who are HIV negative. They are healthy. So what we are doing is we are asking healthy individuals to participate in research that's not going to have any direct benefit to them. They have to do that for the benefit of society and not for their own individual interests. We also have to accept that in this type of research, there are some risks because we're testing new products. And there is some risk attached to that, as well as there's the possibility that some of the participants will become HIV positive despite everything researchers do around risk reduction counseling and providing access to our existing best knowledge on HIV prevention, we always expect some HIV infections. So the nature of the studies itself are complex. And then lastly, it's the framework. And this is really where I'm going to focus the rest of this lecture. Because the third challenge is we can only have adolescents in these types of studies if the actual ethical legal framework itself sets the norms that are going to balance all these competing interests, because we do have competing interests. The interests of society in addressing the HIV epidemic, the interests of scientists, the interests of product developers, the interests of the individual adolescents in the study themselves. And so that framework needs to have a principled basis. It needs to, especially now, have a child rights framework where we look at how can the framework protect children, how can it ensure child participation, not be discriminatory by excluding children, as well as at the same time facilitate research. So if we look at our framework, and does it do any of those things? In the last 21 years, well, I asked the question of, has it come of age? So right back to the beginning, that 2001 year, when I actually started, there was no formal ethical legal framework. It's hard to believe when I look back now that we were in that situation. There were no laws dealing directly with research participants' rights. We had no national ethical guidelines. And there was no legal certainty on whether children could participate in research. There was quite a bit of academic debate, in fact, around the participation of children as healthy volunteers. It was accepted that children, if they were sick, could be participants in the treatment studies, but it was this question of healthy volunteers, because that required children to act altruistically. And so there were debates around, did they have the capacity to make that decision themselves? Could their parents make that decision on their behalf to act really in the interests of everyone else and not in terms of their individual interests? The only sort of normative framework we had was the Medical Research Council. They were our statutory research body, and they had a set of ethical guidelines. These were of limited application. They only applied to the MRC and to research done by the MRC, but they were in some ways regarded as national ethical guidelines because they were the only ones authorized by a statute. And they had their book 1, which was their general principles, dealt with this issue of healthy volunteers. And what they provided was you could do research on children, healthy children, but you would need three things: parental consent. You could only do an observation study. So you couldn't do any intervention. You couldn't test an HIV vaccine because that would require injecting someone with a candidate vaccine product. And your risks had to be negligible, which is a very, very low risk standard. So I remember, in fact, going to a first HAVOC workshop where they brought together scientists and members of ethics committees and researchers, people like myself, to discuss, well, what did this actually mean for the potential of adolescent HIV vaccine study? And there was a speaker there, Professor van Wyk from UNISA, and she just said these studies are not possible, that they will be illegal. And many of you will know Professor Glenda Gray, who's now at the MRC, the CEO there. She just said, well, I'm going to jail because we are going to do these studies with adolescents. And we were all promising to bring her food in jail and all sorts of things. But that was our starting point, was that these studies weren't possible at all. That was 21 years ago. And our barriers were, firstly, the parental consent. this is where the nature of an HIV study comes in. The difficulty is that you are enrolling adolescents who come from a risk a cohort who are in all likelihood engaging in risky behavior. Despite the work of researchers to try and reduce that risk, you are looking at adolescents who are engaging in underage sexual activity, which is illegal. They're potentially they're potentially drug users. It may be young boys having adolescent sex with other young boys. All sorts of risk factors are facing the participants in the study. To now go and ask those adolescents to get their parents to consent for them to be in research is very difficult. And you have very low enrollment rates when you require parental consent. It really acts as a barrier because of children not wanting to disclose these risk activities. The second problem that we faced, and the implications specifically because those ethical guidelines apply to all forms of research with healthy children, but in our specific context, is that we couldn't get away from the fact that it was going to be we needed an intervention study, because all the new HIV prevention methods are things like PrEP, pre-exposure, drugs, etc., the potential of the vaccine. Those are all intervention studies. And that always would bring with it at least a slight increase over minimal risk. So there we were, this very difficult position, and that really continued until 2012. It was only in 2012, so 10 years ago, that we then got a more formalized ethical legal framework, because the National Health came into operation in this period, 2012 to 2015. In this period, because the National Health Act then created, it required research institutions to create ethics committees. Section 71 in the Act dealt directly with the participation of children in research. So we now had a lot more legal certainty. We now knew Professor Glenda Gray did not need to go to jail, because the healthy children could participate in research. But as much as in life, as we go forward, we also slip backwards, because although the Act accepted healthy children could participate in research, which was a big tick, our problem was that the Act, in fact, was very restrictive around parental consent. So it made it mandatory that parents consent, no exceptions whatsoever, have to get consent from either a parent, a legal guardian, that is all. So it didn't even reflect our social reality, where many children live with grandparents or other members of the extended family, a reality that's accepted in our dedicated Children's Act, was not actually addressed in the National Health Act. What also was a big tick in the National Health Act was that they didn't restrict the risk levels, and they didn't restrict it to observational research. So we really moved significantly forward in that second phase. But parental consent really remained, because the other obstacles had now really fallen away. But parental consent remained there as a barrier that we had to try and cross. So in the last phase, from 2015 onwards, the final piece of the puzzle came into place. And that was that the National Health Research Ethics Council, a body created by the National Health Act to regulate all the ethics committees at institutions, produced national ethical guidelines. And this was then the final and important and a very significant implementation element of the framework, because the ethical norms really provided a lot more detail on how research should be undertaken in a way in which the rights and the welfare of research participants were respected. So this new final phase, what was important as well is that barrier of parental consent was addressed. So the ethical guidelines allow for what they refer to as parental waivers, because they now allow, in certain restricted circumstances, that you do not need parental consent for adolescents to be in health research. provided certain those criteria are met. So if we look back and then say, well, has this framework and these three phases, has it actually come of age? And how have we actually addressed those challenges that we had? Well, we certainly have, because we came from not being able to have these studies at all to now being able to have adolescent HIV prevention studies. And so that really is very significant. The problem, I think the underlying problem is really a principled one, that we haven't properly established what are the principles that we wanted to underlie both the ethical and the legal framework around child participation in research. We certainly haven't got the balance, because what we have really done now is we've come from a framework in which there was we only had ethical guidelines. They were very restrictive. Now we've come to a framework where there's law, which is very restrictive, and it's the ethical framework, which is enabling. So we haven't found that balance between the two, and it actually means that the law now is in conflict with the ethical guidelines. And so what do we actually do now? Because we've got this disjuncture. Obviously, the law trumps ethical guidelines, but in this particular context, does it? What we have actually argued that if you look carefully at the National Health Act, Section 73, the section that deals with research ethics committees and how they ought to function and what their role is, there it says that the role of an ethics committee is to ensure that they approve research that they find to be ethical. So we've used that as an argument to try and get round the situation that we're in, and to argue that's the reason why an ethics committee and why researchers can actually do studies without parental consent, because that is ethically justified. Obviously, it's very complex, and we have written around, well, would an ethics committee ever then be liable in terms of the civil law if someone is harmed when an ethics committee has approved a consent strategy that doesn't include parental consent? So it really is, it's an unfortunate situation that we left with. And so in my opinion, we haven't come of age, because we've moved and we've had significant progress, but we've done that in a very haphazard way, and we really are stuck with the situation of a very restrictive provisions in the National Health Act, which act as they are in complete contradiction even with our primary piece of legislation dealing with children, the Children's Act, because the Children's Act takes a totally different principled approach. It focuses on the principles that are recognized in international children's law, that of child participation, that of child protection, non-discrimination, but it tries to balance all those principles, whereas our National Health Act still remains very much in that traditional framework of protecting children from research participation by making the criteria that you have to meet very high. And whilst it seems on the face of it that is a child rights approach, because we're trying to stop children from being harmed in research, but in fact, it's the opposite, because it means that when children don't participate in research, because it's so difficult in this framework, then they can't benefit from science. So it means that we might get a new HIV prevention modality that we can register for adults, but it's going to take 5 or 10 years before we can register that for children. And that means children's rights to science is being denied. So we haven't come of age, because we still need law reform to address the National Health Act. And There are many ways in which it could be reformed. Some argue that it should go, those provisions should go to the Children's Act. Others argue they should just be reformed within the National Health Act. And then our national ethical guidelines, which have really saved us by providing us this opportunity of parental waivers. Even there are many difficulties, and it's really at an implementation level that many researchers find this very complex and difficult, because there are differing approaches. It's allowed for differing approaches amongst ethics committees. Some ethics committees will allow parental waivers and some will not, which is very frustrating for researchers who are really wanting to provide new interventions. And it's not only around HIV prevention research, it's also around TB research and other studies that are interventional in nature that we would want adolescents enrolled in. So looking back over these 21 years, so perhaps like now, just to conclude with some personal reflections. Obviously, looking back, I've tried to think, well, did we make a difference? Because that was all of this really, it sort of evolved. Perhaps it's that walking, to go back to the walking analogy that Professor Friedman spoke about. We were really just wandering along this path with the objective of, it was for me personally an important objective that we could use research and to try and facilitate these prevention studies in a protective way. So did we make a difference? Well, if I look back at some of the things that we did, and this would be like where I would hope that it would be of some guidance to younger researchers. I think one of the important things was we didn't only focus on peer-reviewed research. We did realize that we could impact in other areas. So one of the things that we did was we worked on ethical guidelines. They were very narrow. They were specific to HIV vaccine research. But given the MRC had this very restrictive book 1, we actually helped them produce book 5, which was based on a more modern approach in international ethical guidelines around adolescent participation in prevention studies. We also were very responsive. So we often would get questions from researchers about, well, what do we do? If someone is the grandmother of this child, can they be a participant? And so I found that very useful, being connected into this research community who were raising questions about the framework. And that then always was the way that I thought of what were we going to write about next. So we then knew, well, we've got to try and provide information to researchers on what is the legal difference between a parent, a guardian, a caregiver, so that studies would be done in that appropriate manner. We also explored, I think usefully, ethical dilemmas, like that question of, well, should the ethics committee follow the strict approach in the National Health Act, or should they act ethically and follow ethical guidelines? And so we tried to explore those sorts of questions in quite a lot of depth. And we did produce resource documents as well along the way. Like one, for example, is the 10 recommendation for adolescent studies in South Africa. That is a resource document that we have quite widely distributed, and we're going to go into a next phase where we're hoping to get a grant to actually review, well, to what extent is anyone using that, and does that actually help? We also, in my PhD, is where I explored those principal issues. How do we create the balance? So how do we look at the competing interests and then formulate norms that can guide us? Because we do not want children, adolescents harmed in research, but we do want research. So we have to try and find a way through. And so I explored a lot of that there. So based on those comments, that I'd like to conclude with just 3 lessons that for me really stand out when I look back. And the first lesson is a very individual and personal one. I think to be a good researcher, you really have to understand yourself. So you need to understand your own way of working. If you are going to be a productive researcher, you need to understand, do you work best individually? Do you work best in a group? Who are you going to write with? I was very motivated by working in an interdisciplinary environment. I found that to be, it really stimulated me to work with people from such different backgrounds, academic backgrounds. That was my approach. I certainly found that I do not work well on my own. I need to work in a team. But you do also have to realize that not all teamwork works. Sometimes it just doesn't work, but you mustn't, if that is your strength, don't give up on it. You need to try and find the researchers, the colleagues that you do work well with, that you all complement each other well. I, in my own career, found that I was very lucky that I found a dream team to work with, both Dr. Catherine Slack and Dr. Zainab Essek. You will see if you look at my publications that we have formed although I've worked with many other people as well, that they're really at the core of it. And if you can find that kind of productive team, you will really find it works to your benefit. And it's in that sort of productive team, I felt that I got so much motivation. Other people were relying on me. I couldn't just leave that article for 5 months because other people were wanting my contribution. And it was also within that framework that I was mentored. And it was so helpful to learn how to write within that kind of framework when you're working with experienced people. And then I also think in terms of understanding yourself, we need to distinguish between thinking and writing. Thinking is such an important part of the academic process. You need to identify your own way of unlocking how you think about the complex matters that we have to grapple with. So for myself, as Professor Friedman has said, I find walking to be that space, that walking alone with my dogs in the forest, that's really where I write all the articles. That's when I get back and I quickly start scribbling notes on pieces of paper, because that's how I've resolved things. And it's so important that you find that for yourself. The second important lesson that I learned is that we cannot work alone. We cannot, even if you're an individualist and write individually and that's your strength, you still need to be part of a network. It's very important that your research network is really important in terms of not only learning from the expertise of others, but it's also about being able to expose others to your own work and contribute in that much broader way. So this is also a way in which you can get mentorship outside of your institution from other colleagues, more junior or more senior, and that helps you keep abreast of all of the important issues that actually are happening at the moment, and make sure that your work is relevant because you're continually interacting with this broader group of people. And it's through that you get conference invitations, meeting invitations, and all of which build your research profile. So the final lesson I think is important and that I learned from this process. Don't think I started off with this so clearly in my head, but certainly it evolved along the way that I did have a social justice goal, that of ensuring that adolescents would not be denied their right to new HIV prevention modalities. And so it's really important that obviously that goal meant that in order to achieve that goal is going to have to impact on, if I was going to try and work towards that, I needed to try and impact on well, the laws, the policies, the ethical guidelines that were all around me. And that can be done, I think, in a number of different ways. We can't, as a university, just think that we work in a vacuum. We can't be that ivory tower. We do need to try and think, well, how can we impact? What can we do? We can't just write articles for journals. We need to also be saying, well, like, and I think that's what I successfully learned from Havoc. We try to work on some, we balanced it between the peer-reviewed articles, which was so important, as well as some of the broader literature that we produced. And I think for me, part of the way in which in my specific area I was able to achieve impact was because I did volunteer in 2 ethics committees. And it was at those ethics committees that I was able to then be part of the decision-making process around, well, are we going to find this study ethical or not? And able to make those arguments for child participation in a very protective manner. So I would say to other colleagues, look for those volunteer opportunities. Look to see what are the committees that you can be on, which are going to have some impact on your area where you're trying to develop yourselves. So finally, it's really just for me to say thank you to everyone. There are people here in the room with me, my family, my friends, my colleagues, who are also, I would say, without a doubt, my friends. I saw a TV advert the other day, which for me really resonated. And it was that there's an African proverb that if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with others. And I feel that I chose the wanting to go with others. And for me, that certainly was the right choice. And all of the people in these pictures have certainly made a significant impact on the research and the work that I've done. So thank you to everyone.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Strode, for your most excellent and insightful and relevant lecture. As mentioned, adolescents, like adults, have the right in international law to benefit from scientific progress. In the context of HIV research, this requires scientists to focus on obtaining data that will directly benefit health interventions for this specific age group. The fascinating challenge, as pointed out by Professor Strode, is to determine if the South African ethical legal framework regulating adolescent research participation can accommodate the scientists' needs and adolescents' rights. However, the current dichotomy between the law and ethics suggests that a definitive conclusion is not possible at this stage. Ladies and gentlemen, I also want to thank the Registrar's Office and our excellent teams from the Corporate Relations and the ICS divisions for their efforts with the logistical arrangements for this lecture. Finally, dear ladies and gentlemen, I thank you warmly for joining us at Professor Strode's inaugural lecture, and I hope that you will join me in congratulating her once again. Thank you and goodbye.